Good afternoon and welcome to University Hospital's coronavirus update related to flu season and vaccine update. My name is Dr. Dan Simon. I'm the Chief Clinical and Scientific Officer and the President of University Hospital's Cleveland Medical Center. I'm going to be joined today by Dr. Bob Salata, the Physician-in-Chief of University Hospitals. Bob was just attending to a medical issue and he's joining us live right now. So welcome, Bob. It's great to be here. We have a very busy 45 to 50 minutes planned for today. And what I'd like to do, as usual, before we get down to your questions, is to just provide a brief update on where we are today. What I'd like to do is to share with you, I think, some slides that will very dramatically illustrate for you where we are right now. So many of you have become accustomed to my comments related to green, yellow, and red. And we've definitely entered a flashing red situation right now. On this graph in front of you, you see United States daily COVID cases by time starting in March and now through approximately October 17th on this graph. And what you can see is we are clearly into a dramatic increase in cases since about the first week of September of 2020. So what you would say is we're sort of into another surge, and this would be the third surge. What's most dramatic is pictured in this slide, which is a state-by-state date of peak daily COVID cases. And what you can see right here is that in the green colors are when cases peaked in April and May, and the orange-brown colors, September and October. In those states outlined in black are states that peaked just last Thursday of last week. And what you can see is the Midwest, Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, coupled with North Dakota, Montana, and other states really are peaking right now of the highest cases in the entire COVID pandemic. What's happening in Ohio? Well, we're flashing red. And as you can see here, just a dramatic increase in cases, reaching our highest daily case count just last week on October 17th, with over 2,300 cases in a single day. So right now, Ohio is a stressed environment for COVID. Now, a couple of signs in the last couple of days that trend from last week is getting a little bit better. In the last 24 hours, we've had 1,837 cases compared to that peak of over 2,200 cases last Thursday. Deaths remain low at 8. Hospitalizations are sawtoothing up and down, but 111 hospitalizations in the last 24 hours compared to a 21-day average of only 89. And as you can see, ICU admissions remain relatively flat. That increase in caseload up to 2,200 cases would not be expected to lead to a big bump in hospitalizations for about 5 to 7 days, so we need to stay tuned. Well, what's happening at university hospitals? Well, as you can see, we're experiencing something similar. Although our case count is low at only 43 cases across the entire health system, what you can see is we've almost doubled since September 25, where we had just a little over 20 cases. So we're starting to see that increase in caseload across the health system as well. So with that, I would like to, bring Bob in here and really ask him, I guess, the fundamental question, which is, Bob, what's going on, and why is this case volume suddenly increasing?
I think there was some complacency that set in as people were seeing these numbers go down. So that's one thing that happened. Number two, many of the new cases described have been almost 2 decades younger in terms of age. And many of the places in Ohio, for instance, are focused in and around Dayton, Cincinnati, Columbus, where the large colleges and universities are. And all of you have seen pictures of the college-age students trying to celebrate, thinking they're invulnerable. And it is true that statistically, they're less likely to go on to severe disease, complications, and death. But I think as part of that, it's been that mindset that has brought this to these individuals. But on the other hand, we have much to do in educating the university age group in terms of the fact that once they're infected, they can serve thereafter as a reservoir to transmit this to our aged and those with vulnerable conditions. So I think that threat is really there. And we as healthcare providers have an obligation to educate these younger people about the consequences of what they do. We are also seeing increases in the age group between 18 and 30 now, which captures understandably the university-based population, but even a little bit lower from the ages of 15 to 18. We're also seeing that. And we've been very fortunate in this area, as you pointed out already, Dan, to not see the same level of spike in cases that the rest of Ohio and the country is seeing. The two places in the country statewide that are experiencing the most cases are California and Florida. Ohio remains around 16th in frequency of cases, but it is surging again, and we need to keep that in mind. Worldwide, there have been many more cases, and you've read about what's happening in Europe, for instance, in places like the UK, Spain, France, and even Italy again. At the beginning, Italy was one of the primary areas where we saw this happening, but that's happening there as well. And I think people not only have become complacent, but has been illustrated in some reports, are actually so frustrated with what we really have to do in order to control this. We'll talk later, I'm sure, about the vaccine initiatives of where those stand and how those will impact on this curve, bending this curve. But it's very, as you pointed out in your very first slide, we're going to be entering the respiratory virus season with influenza and other things like respiratory syncytial virus, mainly in children. And we're going to see potentially, as people have pointed out, a twindemic that is both coronavirus and influenza happening at the same time. And that's going to be even more challenging as we move into the next couple months.
Bob, I think one of the things that we really need to talk to our friends about who are on this WebEx today is really, the notion that we know you're tired. I mean, I'm tired. Bob is tired. This is, as we talk about, this is now, it's more than a marathon. It keeps going on. And I think one of the things that we need to try to discuss today, and maybe I'll leave you with this, with this thought, is that fundamentally, nothing's changed from a treatment and a prevention standpoint. That's very hard, I think, for a lot of people to grasp. We talked last time and when we got together before about developing this flu-like equivalent of Tamiflu as an antiviral and a flu vaccine. And when you think about COVID, well, first, we don't have the vaccine yet. And second of all, we don't really have an oral Tamiflu equivalent. We have a moderately effective IV drug called remdesivir, which probably shortens hospitalization 15 days, down to 10 days, probably associated with a mortality reduction, some controversial data that first came out. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with what things people don't, they're a little tired of doing. It's the mundane. It's hand washing, hand washing, and hand washing. It's physical distancing. It's masking when you can, and engineering controls when you're in situations when you can't necessarily stay away from people. So I don't know, Bob, I guess you and I have been a little bit of a broken record on this. Dr. Fauci's taken a lot of heat about it. But from a public health standpoint, what is the most important thing that we can do right now? What can we do for ourselves? What can we do for our families?
So you're absolutely right, Dan. And the complacency and fatigue has set in. And I think that is part of what's motivating the increased spike in cases. To that end, however, unless we remain vigilant about those infection control measures, there are concerns and models that suggest that the number of deaths in the United States by early winter may be as high as 500,000. And that's extraordinary in terms of where we're at. Around the world, it's over 1 million deaths have been ascribed to coronavirus and COVID-19. So those approaches have to be still maintained. That is, countered by the anti-maskers and people that feel it's against their personal freedom to force these things. But, in states like Ohio, where the governor and others have really made it mandatory to wear masks, I think it did at one time, in bending the curve, bring down the number of new cases by 33% or so. I think we have to double our efforts again. As to whether or not to go back to sheltering in place, that's going to be an issue that we're going to have to take one day at a time. Obviously, the economy is just starting to pick up, but it can really deteriorate again if we go to the extreme. So that all has to be balanced, but I think that's an important thing to state. Lastly, even with the initiation of vaccine campaigns around this country and elsewhere, we're going to have to still rely upon these same measures that you spoke about until we see that we've reached a level of so-called herd immunity, which requires that, at least in terms of measuring antibodies in the general population, we're at a level of as low as perhaps 45%, as high as 70%. And we also don't think that all people will accept the vaccine, for one. And if we reach a level of protective immunity after vaccination of 70% plus, then I think we're going to see that the vaccine campaign will really make a difference here. But in the meanwhile, and even during the vaccine campaign, we have to be vigilant about these measures that you spoke about.
Terrific. So, Bob, we have a lot of questions that we got to get through here. And so I'm going to start firing away. People obviously can send me questions as well. And the first one, which is, I know one of your favorites, is why do I need a flu shot? And when is the best time to get one? And is it ever too late? So that's a great one. We're on our flu shot campaign in the hospital. We got to get to 90% compliance, and we got a little ways to go yet. So tell us about flu shots.
So let me reflect back a little bit on, and I've said this before, Dan, and maybe to this group as well, what transpired during the flu season in the Southern Hemisphere, which they just went through their winter time and flu season. And it was extraordinary to see the numbers of cases that were greatly diminished. In Australia, for instance, whereas they usually report over 70,000 cases per year, they had 70. And in the entire country of South Africa, which has a relatively sophisticated medical system there, they saw 1 documented case. So I think all the measures that we just spoke about that are important for trying to control COVID, are very applicable to the influenza setting. Track back to the United States, where we have a number of people that are not practicing these measures. And I think it poses a risk for what people have called a twindemic, where coronavirus plus influenza will be in place at the same time. And clinically, it's not always easy to distinguish these syndromes. So I would push for vaccination in a major way. The best time to get vaccinated based upon the length of the influenza season is probably late September and through October. But even in November, it's not too late. And I think that's an important part of the process. Whatever we could do to mitigate influenza as a other process in addition to COVID is advantageous to the general population, their health, and also to physicians trying to evaluate those individuals. I think that we should also understand that the influenza vaccine, albeit has been reported each year to be about 40 to 50% effective, in the end, those that get the vaccine but still have breakthrough influenza have milder disease, are hospitalized less, die less frequently. So those are clear advantages. So it's not an all or none phenomenon, and I think that needs to be stressed. So we would carefully urge that. This year, new on the scene, for those of you that might be at or greater than the age of 65, is a new high dose vaccine that contains all 4 of the circulating or predicted circulating strains in the US coming up. Prior to this year, we only had 3 of the 4. And the regular flu vaccine has all 4 as well. So I think we've standardized that across the board. Studies by many, including from this institution, have shown there's about a 25% decrease in death, hospitalizations, et cetera, for older folks who receive the higher dose vaccine without the cost of many severe side effects. So I think that's very important, and it is the time to get this in the consideration of COVID spiking up again.
So let's go back to something you said, which I think is really important for our friends to hear, and that relates to the symptoms. So many of us, you have heard us talk about the symptoms of COVID, which include cough, myalgias, muscle aches, body aches, now sore throat, temperature, abdominal complaints, loss of taste and smell. So aside from the loss in taste and smell, that sounds a lot like the flu. So that brings into this notion that if I'm home and suddenly I'm feeling viral, so to speak, achy all over, and I feel chilled and I have a cough, okay, tell me, Bob, you're the great infectious disease doctor who I call now almost every other day for a question. How do I detect what's going on? What am I supposed to do?
So a great question. As mentioned before, these symptoms are very overlapping, and I think that's the first thing to realize. There is a little bit of difference in terms of the amount of sore throat, runny nose and congestion that occurs more often with influenza or for that matter, allergies, the latter congestion, as opposed to COVID. The 3 most important symptoms now seen in a recent review of over 5 million US cases of COVID-19. The 3 you should always remember include fever, although it may not be necessarily present at the outset. Number 2 is the non-productive cough, and the 3rd is the shortness of breath. The other things are important. Diarrhea would occur a little more frequently in COVID as opposed to influenza, except during the H1N1 pandemic of influenza, we saw GI involvement as well. So nothing is perfect here. But I do think it's important to stress that at university hospitals, we're going to have the capability of testing with 1 swab for both. And that's a very important advancement. The other thing I just want to point out lastly, Dan, is that last year, there were reports primarily accumulated from Stanford University out in California. And they really recounted cases where not only COVID was present, but an associated other viral respiratory pathogen. And it was about 12 to 15% for influenza. So they can occur together. And I think that would be an unfortunate situation. That will be tracked again this winter to see how that interaction goes. But I think, again, that's another reason to get the flu vaccine at the get-go.
Yeah, and I think, we should emphasize that it's very difficult to tell the difference. If you develop a flu-like illness with cough, fever, as Bob mentioned, and some shortness of breath, that's definitely call the doctor and you will get tested. And, we will have influenza A, influenza B, RSV, and COVID in one swab. And I think that that's going to be really important to help tease this out. Now, Bob, we're getting
the other thing, if I could just add, Dan, is as you mentioned before, we do have treatment available for influenza, especially if it's given early.
Yes.
And a vaccine that's not quite as effective as we'd like it to be. We're working on a universal influenza vaccine for the future, where we may not require vaccination every single year. And that is the case for influenza, just to end, because the virus itself can change in its outside covering, either a little bit or in a major way, which can be associated with a pandemic. Pandemic is a worldwide occurrence of this, and that was last seen in 2009.
So one of the questions that's coming up, Bob, is high on everybody's mind. It's October 20th today, and a lot of us are making Thanksgiving Day plans. And so this is raising a very important question by several folks on the line here, and that is, what about Thanksgiving? And I think the concern obviously comes from not the parents and the grandparents who've been being very careful in quarantining, but it's, of course, all of our great children and grandchildren who come home, and there becomes potentially the problem. So Tell us about Thanksgiving, and what are you doing in the highly productive Salata household with so many great kids and grandchildren?
Right. So great question. And very importantly, the CDC has put out new data of late that shows the other means of transmission are in family settings now. With the very scenario that you're pointing, Dan, where people come in, get together, they're traveling from multiple different sites, traveling through different airports, et cetera. We need to understand, again, where most of the cases are being seen now. And with children, including school children back in school, that remains another risk, although the occurrence of very young children with COVID is still relatively low, fortunately. But it's the high schoolers to a lesser extent, and certainly the greatest risk will be those from university and college settings that are traveling to that area. So if you're going to hold that kind of setting or gathering, you should be careful about still respecting the infection control measures that we spoke about, with masks and distancing, hand hygiene, et cetera. I think that still is warranted based upon the newest data emerging. So we don't want to thwart your ability to have these gatherings, but I think it's going to require that you be a little extra careful. And with the holidays coming up beyond Thanksgiving, that will be also applicable.
Yeah, it's interesting, Bob. I've been to some incredibly creative, very small indoor events, but events where distancing is maintained with, multiple smaller tables, and of course, masking before actually eating. But they're incredibly, as you could imagine, since, we're not doing a lot of it, it's very, very special to come together, even if you have 4 tables separated by a good space. And I think it can be done responsibly, but we really need to be careful. And of course, those individuals who are high risk, and we've talked about this before, so over 65, heart disease, lung disease, diabetes, obesity, active or recent cancer treatment, and immunosuppression for any other reason, those individuals need to take extra care. And I think it's really important that everybody tries to pull together for those individuals to make it a happy holiday. We've heard about some just dramatic super spreader events at that Sweet 16 on Long Island, which resulted in nearly 50 or 60 infections.
Yeah, about 37 cases, as I recall.
Yeah, and then also a recent wedding. So, okay, well, now I guess for our special snowbird friends who are heading to Florida and Arizona, so the big question, Bob, is it safe to travel? How should they get there? And once they're there, what should they do?
Right. So given the long distances, as well as the age of our snowbirds, I think it's really very difficult to consider doing this by car or other means, but that's a possibility as long as one stops frequently and practices those issues that we spoke about before. I do think that there have been some recent studies published by the Department of Defense in conjunction with United Airlines, where they purposely, in an empty cabin, uh, you know, sprayed particles and then looked at various areas of the airplane to see how far they went and a relative risk in that regard. Obviously, they didn't use COVID per se, but that was very reassuring in terms of the fact that even persons sitting right next to you were probably not at high risk at all. That in conjunction with the fact that you're going to be wearing a mask and practicing, you will not be allowed to go on the flight unless you answer the survey of questions about potential respiratory illness and COVID particularly. And I think hand washing and all that other business really would be applicable. I think I have become more comfortable in suggesting that air flight is probably not a very high risk activity. In the airports, however, that's different because people are going to be all around. There's going to be varying use of those measures we talked about, including masks. So you have to be especially careful there. And you're going to have to find out what's happening in your specific community. Either in Arizona, most of our folks go to Phoenix area and Southwest Florida, but some on the East Coast as well. So you have to find out what's going on. And in some ways, it's not applicable right now, but you need to remain informed as to whether or not travel to those two states will require quarantining because you're coming from Ohio where we're seeing this uptick in cases. So those are all additional considerations. Still, the other CDC piece of information that's very important to understand, aside from the family gatherings that we spoke about, is that over 50% of new cases seem to be related to in-restaurant dining. And in that regard, it's still better, especially in Florida and Arizona, to eat outside on a patio and or use takeout as another possibility. But I think going inside of restaurants is another potential hazard.
Yep. So one of the things, Bob, that I think, and I can't emphasize that enough, the estimates of the risk of COVID infection on an airplane that has 6 seats, so 3 on the left center aisle, 3 on the right, with no middle occupancy based on modeling, is less than 1 in 4,000,
right.
Especially because air exchange is every 3 to 5 minutes with HEPA filters that take out 99.9% of viral particles. So I think it is important to emphasize those of you who are eating out indoors in a restaurant, it's probably higher risk than flying on an airplane.
Right.
Certainly length of flight makes a difference, but flying to Florida or Arizona is not international travel, and that's probably it's probably safe. So we would want to say that it can be done, but you need to be careful in the process of doing it. I certainly flew over the summer to Boston to move my son in, and that was an N95 and a face shield. And the good news for me was I think people were taken aback enough by the N95 and the face shield that no one sat within 8 rows of me. So I was on like a private airplane in the back there on JetBlue. So I felt really very comfortable. Okay, so Bob, lots and lots of questions. Let's do this. This is a great segue question for our next topic. Are vaccine candidates being tested in children? And that's great news because tell us why that's so good for us.
So in many clinical trials at the outset, these are generally conducted in adult age groups and not in children. That comes later. But if we're considering a vaccine campaign that will be widespread through the country, despite the fact that younger children are not at as high risk for serious disease, we are beginning, at least in our study, which is the Pfizer study, to look at age groups as low as the age of 12. Heretofore, we've been mainly vaccinating in those at 18 years of age or older. And I think that is very important if we want to generalize the principles of protection, including to younger age groups. I was just meeting with our Pfizer representative this morning who has oversight of our site. By the way, they felt everything is going so well here. They were very impressed. But on the other hand, we asked about sub-studies coming in the future. And I think there'll be more studies looking at other groups, including younger children. And I think that's going to be an important new step. To my knowledge, Pfizer is the only vaccine campaign or platform that's studying this in children right now. They will study up to 5,000 children between the ages of 12 and 17. And the other ones are focusing on the adults so far. So far, so good. But we do need that information. We have no reason to believe that the vaccine will be less effective or less safe in children as well. But I think having some information to back that up because of the anti-vaxxers out there, among other groups, will be very important as we move forward.
So Bob, a series of questions that we'll need to discuss now really relate to the problems that have come up with two vaccines, one from AstraZeneca and one from Johnson & Johnson. And I think what's obviously, we have a very sophisticated person who's asking the question, is that both of those are actually modified adenoviruses, whereas the Pfizer vaccine is a messenger RNA vaccine. So is that telling us something about the safety of modified viral vaccines versus this other method? And maybe you could comment a little bit about what you know about the delay of AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, because we have a lot of questions on that.
Yeah, it's a very insightful and sophisticated question from one of our participants today. It's possible that that is the case because they're both on an attenuated adenovirus vector to incorporate the genes from coronavirus that are then made into proteins that are subsequent to that antibodies, protective antibodies and T-cell responses develop. That said, there are other adenovirus vaccines out there. And more recently, it has been done with Ebola virus, although we haven't tested that in the United States, such that we did not see that kind of safety signal. There were actually 2 reports of the same type of side effect with the AstraZeneca vaccine. And this is a condition called transverse myelitis, which is inflammation of the spinal cord, often resulting in weakness, particularly of the lower extremities, sometimes both arms and legs, and also some pins and needles feelings, etc. Sometimes this can be a permanent sequela, residual afterwards, but the one case that occurred early on in early stage studies with AstraZeneca, they had very good evidence that that person coincidentally developed acute multiple sclerosis, which can present with this syndrome. And this has been triggered by other viruses and a number of other conditions. All we know about the more recent case in a woman from the UK is that when they looked at this independently with an advisory board and reported back up to their equivalent of our Food and Drug Administration, FDA, they were sufficiently satisfied at that point to resume vaccination in the UK and in Brazil, which is another hotspot. We have not restarted in the United States yet. I'll come back to Johnson & Johnson in a second. But right now, there is a very thorough review being done by both the FDA and the National Institutes of Health, who co-sponsored the AstraZeneca vaccine in the US. And until those reports are available, they are not willing to restart that vaccine trial, at least in the US at the moment. When you look at this phenomena of transverse myelitis, not to get too much in the weeds, there's a database associated with the FDA that's been kept for 25 years in conjunction with any side effects that are seen with vaccines or purported to be. And there were 119 cases of transverse myelitis. That sounds like a lot, but that was over a 15-year period. And the most convincing ones, maybe 35% of those occurred within a 6 to 8 week period after vaccination. The remainder, 65%, sometimes were years, months and years out. And it's harder to make a cause and effect relationship in that manner. So that's some comforting data, but that's what we know. So AstraZeneca is still on hold. Johnson & Johnson was the fourth vaccine company to set up vaccination in the US. And the potential advantages of this vaccine is it only had to be kept at refrigeration in a refrigerator, and it was one single injection. All the others, including AstraZeneca and Pfizer and Moderna, required two separate vaccine injections. And they require different storage capabilities, the most egregious of which is the Pfizer vaccine, ours, where it has to be in the deep freeze. And to that end, neither Moderna, and it's curious about this question, nor Pfizer have seen these kinds of side effects. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine has been called an unexplained illness. Nothing more about that. And they have been criticized by some, but by not being as forthcoming about the exact nature of that reported adverse event. So we wait more information. Right now, they're on a global hold. AstraZeneca has started to revaccinate. No other cases have emerged that I'm aware of, but we have not restarted in the United States.
Great. So, I think one of the questions, that everybody has is, so when will this vaccine be made available? We do know from Pfizer and his CEO that there are ongoing reviews in Europe and in Canada, and there is a commitment in the United States through an emergency use authorization mechanism to potentially start distributing vaccine in December. We did review in our last session the guidelines from the CDC and the FDA related to the phases of vaccination. And it is worth, again, just for those of you who maybe did not participate in the last session, in phase 1A, first responders and healthcare workers, especially frontline healthcare workers, will be vaccinated, followed in phase 1B by those over 65 years of age, and then subsequent to that, high-risk conditions shortly thereafter. And so I do think that one of the challenges, as Bob mentioned last time, is we have purchased 100 million doses of Pfizer through through the government's Warp Speed project for just short of $2 billion. And those vaccinations from Pfizer would cover about 50 million Americans. The challenge, as you've pointed out before, Bob, is that we have to vaccinate nearly 300 million people. And even if 20 or 30% decline, it's still over 250 million. And that's led, as you've heard Bob say before, to the likelihood that we need more than one solution of vaccines. Now, let's just change gears for 1 minute, because I'm getting a whole bunch of questions about these antibody cocktails from Regeneron and from Eli Lilly. And maybe, Bob, you could explain what is a monoclonal antibody cocktail, and why is Eli Lilly's monoclonal antibody cocktail on hold now?
Right. It's on hold because they had another unexplained side effect. And that was mainly seen in hospitalized patients who have many other reasons for having these similar side effects. In their use of that product in the outpatient area, they did not have that occur, but they're being careful about that. And we're looking to become one of the sites to do the inpatient
Yeah.
antibody cocktail. So antibodies develop their proteins that our own white blood cells produce. They're called B cells and plasma cells. And these are, extruded into the bloodstream. And in general, these come about with either other vaccines that you are given and or infections that you are faced with. And they are very important in controlling the infection in addition to whatever therapeutics or treatments that we have available. So the one thing I just want to track back to briefly is the use of convalescent plasma. And we had two studies going on here, one orchestrated by the Mayo Clinic and the other one related to its use in patients that were at high risk for cardiac complications from COVID. And it's interesting when you look at over 30,000 people given convalescent plasma from the Mayo Clinic study, which has been published, it was only a certain subset of folks that really had a good beneficial response with a 35% decrease in mortality and death rate. And those turned out to be those less than the age of 85, and those also not requiring mechanical ventilation, a ventilator, and those that in retrospect had very high levels of antibodies in the plasma directed against COVID-19. So the message to me from that, therefore, is that if you can develop antibodies in very high levels that are very specific to COVID, outside of the use of plasma, convalescent plasma, that makes sense. And this has been done in other settings too. Ebola was another example. I brought that up before. But we tried this. We were part of an NIH study during the pandemic influenza period, and the use of convalescent plasma was beneficial there too. So these are what are called monoclonal antibodies, the same, very same antibody, but directed against different pieces or parts of the virus. The most important of which we think is when you look at those pictures of coronavirus, Dan had the very first slide, it's that protein, that little area that he's putting it right up. There you go. That juts out from the outside covering, that's called the spike protein. By the way, all the vaccines being developed are using the spike protein as the major thing that we want to focus our immune responses against. And if you look at other COVID infection, coronavirus infections, SARS-1, some of you remember that in the early 2000s, and MERS, which happened in the Middle East, it was when one developed antibodies directed against that spike protein, which prevented it from attaching to and being taken inside of respiratory cells, among other places, that they were able to abort the infection and or they were protected against recurrent infection. So we think that's very important. So it's not only spike protein, but other proteins to which these monoclonal antibodies are directed. And it's a mixture of them that we're utilizing. And I think that's being used as a early stage treatment with the idea that this would prevent progression, as we have seen in terms of the complications of COVID-19. So what exactly was the adverse reaction in the inpatient approach trial with the Eli Lilly product is not known at this time. So we're still clarifying that.
Terrific. So just a couple of really quick questions and a couple of clarifications. One, the question was, does emergency use authorization imply that there isn't a phase 3 trial? No. The Pfizer vaccine will have over 44,000 patients. It will complete a phase 3 trial for both safety and efficacy before approval. So I think both the NIH and the FDA have been very clear. There'll be no vaccines until completion of phase 3 trials, which will give definitive efficacy and safety information. Bob, another question very quickly. This is somebody who happens to be 75 years old, has high blood pressure and diabetes. Both are very well controlled. Is he in a high risk group if those are controlled? Is his risk mitigated or is it still high risk?
I think whoever asked the question, your risk is mitigated by way of the fact that your underlying medical conditions are controlled. This is the way we're enrolling patients right now in the Pfizer study. So if you have controlled chronic medical conditions, you're allowed to be enrolled, and we'll have that very information for you. But from all we know, the less controlled your underlying conditions are, the more at risk you are for serious disease and death. So that will be answered for you.
Another question, Bob. Should homeowners put HEPA-like filters into their HVAC systems?
Sure. I think if you're a very high-risk individual and there's going to be people coming and going, they're relatively inexpensive, on the order of $100 to $200. They look like a dehumidifier and basically provide another level of protection. We did advocate for this with one of our other VIPs, and that's been put into place in that home. And also when they traveled, you asked about travel to Florida, et cetera, that was another approach that we recommended. So if you understand that this is another additional safety measure and you're not threatened by the cost, which is not exorbitant, I think that's another thing to consider. If you need information specifically about these units, we can provide that for you.
Another very practical question. Is it safe to use bathrooms in the airport and on the airplane?
I think, yes. There had been earlier on in the pandemic concerned about particularly toilets and the aerosolization that occurred after flushing the toilet, that this would be, given that this can live in the GI tract, concerns about transmission in that way. But I think that's not been substantiated in a high number of cases. But I think, again, undertaking what you need to do, closing the lid before you flush, and then hand hygiene afterwards, both in restaurants and on the planes, would be the appropriate thing to do. Wearing a mask while you're in there too.
Great. Another question, again, we have some very sophisticated biologists and immunologists calling in, is the question about the individual in the United States who had a documented reinfection, also implying the notion that different strains, possibly through mutation, may make this vaccine story a little bit more complicated. I know this is very rare, Bob, worldwide. What do you think about that?
So it's another terrific question. And let me just say that around the world right now, with the millions and millions of cases reported globally, there have now been about 6 definitively documented cases. And the way that they, I think, scientifically prove this is that they have maintained or kept the original virus causing their first syndrome.
Yeah.
Then at a subsequent time, the next virus that was acquired, and they were compared genetically, they are different. And the first case around the world, that was in Hong Kong, with a young man who had the Wuhan virus, as it's been called, and then traveled to Spain about 4 months later, and then came back and developed syndrome again. It's been very variable in terms of the cases, whether or not the second episode is the same, less, or even worse than the first time through. But I think it's still important, as you point out, Dan, that it's still a very infrequent occurrence right now. And that's one of the things that in the Pfizer trial, we're going to be following people out to 26 months. Because the most important endpoint there, even though we'll have these other markers of immune responsiveness, including antibody T-cell responses, is going to look at COVID-19 cases in the vaccine and the placebo recipients. And those will be stored, and we could actually look at reinfection in those cases as we need to moving forward. So it has been proven now, I think, scientifically. It's been speculated clinically that this has happened. And it also gets into the issue of the longevity of the antibody response. In natural infection, it is more robust and seems to last longer in those that have more symptomatic disease. Those that are either asymptomatic or have mild disease, those antibody levels are sometimes undetectable about 3 months in. But immunologists have raised the point that if you're re-exposed, you might have a great boost in those antibody and T cell responses so that you'll still be protected. And I think that's probably the case based upon the few cases that have been documented so far. There's only one case, as you may have read about in the Netherlands, where a woman who had a second bout really died on the second occasion of a COVID-19 infection.
Well, you know, it's almost 10 minutes to the hour, which means that we've come to an end. Really want to thank you, Bob. Again, just a tremendous, tremendous session. Updating us. Your knowledge of this area brings a lot of us a lot of comfort in a very difficult time. I do want to point out how much we appreciate the support of all of you out there, our very special friends of university hospitals. Your support during this time, your words of encouragement, your time and your gifts have meant a lot to us. Of course, uhgiving.org/coronavirus is still open. You know, patients are continuing to come in. Frontline healthcare workers still have needs. So if there's any a place in the end of the year for university hospitals, we would greatly appreciate it. Just to give you an example of that, we're sitting here now with Dr. Bob Salata, who's the medical director of the Roe Green Center for Travel Medicine and Global Health. We appreciate the tremendous support that Roe has provided to us to really advance these activities. And of course, I'm incredibly grateful for the recent generosity of Ernie and Patty Novak and their incredible gift, naming me the Distinguished Chair of Healthcare Leadership. That's a new title, but one that means so much to me. So I would like to invite you back in a month's time, hopefully in a month's time, for another update. It seems, Bob, that waiting 4 weeks now is a long time because so much happens. I remembered, I looked back at my notes from a month ago and I did yellow light, but I was almost going to do a yellow green at the same time because we were down to almost 20 cases. And look what happens in only 4 weeks. We're the highest we've been since March. So thank you all for tuning in. I think we had at our peak today almost 150 different logins, and some of you are probably watching together. So have a great day, and we'll see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.